The alarm in my chamber did not chime. It screamed. I had never heard that sound before, not in 40 years of service to the Galactic Council, and for a moment I simply stood there letting it tear through the air while my mind refused to accept what it meant. A red light pulsed above my door. Emergency session. Full attendance required. No delay permitted. My name is Varick Soul, and I have spent my career as a liaison officer assigned to newly contacted species. I have welcomed 11 different worlds into the Council. I have watched fear turn into obedience, and obedience turn into gratitude, on every single one of them. It is a pattern so reliable that we stopped questioning it generations ago. Until today. I left my quarters still fastening my robe and joined the river of officials flowing toward the central chamber. Nobody spoke. That alone told me something had gone wrong in a way none of us had a name for. Council officials always speak. We speak about procedure, about precedent, about the correct order of greetings. Silence was new. Silence was worse than shouting. Inside the chamber, the seats were already full. Delegates from the Korathi cluster sat rigid, their long fingers laced together so tightly the joints had turned pale. The USA representative, usually the calmest voice in any room, was standing rather than seated, pacing in short, tight steps behind her chair. At the center of the chamber, on the main display, hung a single message. It had been sent from a small blue world at the edge of explored space, a world we called New Terra in our official records. The humans called it Earth. The message was short. No greeting, no formal address, no acknowledgement of rank or protocol, the things every species learns within their first year of contact, the things that show respect for the order that holds 1,000 worlds together. It read, "We have reviewed your offer. We decline." That was all. 4 words, no explanation, no negotiation opened, no counter-demand. In the history of the Council, spanning more centuries than I can properly count, no species had ever responded to the Unity Tribute Accord with outright refusal. Species negotiated terms. Species asked for more time. Species occasionally tried to delay payment through clever legal arguments crafted by their sharpest minds. But refusal, clean and total, had simply never happened. I felt my chest tighten as I took my seat. Around me, the chamber buzzed with low, urgent conversation, voices overlapping in different languages, translated through small devices clipped to every collar, creating a strange, layered hum of fear. The chief arbiter, an old Tesserine named Holdren Vey, called the session to order. His 4 eyes moved slowly across the room before settling on me. "You handled the New Terra contact," he said. It was not a question. I stood. My legs felt unsteady beneath me, though I could not say exactly why. I had handled contact protocols on worlds far more hostile in appearance. I had once negotiated with a species whose entire culture was built around ritual combat. None of those assignments had ever made my hands feel cold the way they did now. "I did, Arbiter," I said. "I oversaw the initial contact, the cultural exchange phase, and the treaty proposal itself." "And how?" he asked, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow felt more threatening than shouting would have. "Did a single planet manage to reject the accord with 4 words and no further communication?" I did not have an answer ready. The truth was, I had reviewed the human responses dozens of times in the hours leading up to this moment, searching for some clue I had missed, some signal of aggression or fear that would explain their behavior within the patterns we understood. I found nothing that matched our models. "They are not behaving according to expected variables," I admitted. "Every species we have contacted shows a measurable fear response when presented with our fleet capacity. Humans did not show this response." A murmur spread through the chamber. The Korathi delegate leaned forward, his pale fingers gripping the edge of his desk. "Explain," Holdren said. "I called up the recorded footage from our first display of strength, the standard procedure used during every contact event. A formation of Council warships, more than any single world could ever hope to match, moving in slow, deliberate patterns above the human planet's moon. This display had ended 6 previous negotiations before they even began, with species begging for terms rather than risking conflict. The humans on the recording, gathered in what they called a control room, watched the same footage. I had expected widened eyes, frozen postures, the universal signs of a species recognizing its own smallness. Instead, a human man near the front of the group turned to the woman beside him and said something I will never forget. The translation software rendered it simply, but the weight of it has stayed with me since. "That's a lot of ships," he said. "Wonder how many we'd need to make that interesting." Laughter followed. Actual laughter, light and easy, the kind a person makes when amused rather than afraid. The chamber fell silent as the recording ended. I switched off the display and turned back to face the assembled council. "That is the moment I should have understood," I said, but I dismissed it as an isolated reaction, an unusual personality among the human delegation. I now believe it was not isolated. I believe it was simply what an honest human looks like when shown overwhelming force. Holdren's eyes narrowed, all four of them focusing on me at once. "You are suggesting the human species, as a whole, does not experience fear in the way every other recorded civilization does," he said. "I am suggesting something more troubling, Arbiter," I said, and I felt the words leave my mouth before I had fully decided to speak them. "I am suggesting they experience fear normally, and have simply decided it does not control their choices." The chamber erupted. Several delegates rose from their seats at once, voices climbing over each other in a dozen translated tongues. The USA representative demanded immediate military escalation. The Karathi delegate argued for patience, reminding the room that humans had shown no aggression, only refusal. An older delegate from a species I did not recognize shouted something about precedent being meaningless if a single world could simply ignore it without consequence. I stood frozen at the center of this storm, watching panic spread through the most powerful governing body in known space. All because 4 words had arrived from a planet most of us had never visited, sent by a species that, by every metric we use to measure threat, should have posed none at all. Holdren raised a hand, and slowly, reluctantly, the chamber quieted. "This session is adjourned for 1 hour," he said. "During that time, I want every available record on human behavior, history, and conflict pulled and reviewed. I want to understand what we are dealing with before this council makes a single further decision." As the delegates filed out, murmuring uneasily among themselves, I remained seated, staring at the empty space where the message had hung moments before. 4 words. "We have reviewed your offer. We decline." I thought about every contact event I had personally overseen. I thought about species that had wept with relief upon learning they would be permitted to join the council rather than face its fleet. I thought about leaders who had thanked us, actually thanked us, for the privilege of paying tribute in exchange for protection from threats that, as far as anyone could determine, did not currently exist. And I thought about the human in that control room, laughing at the sight of a fleet larger than his entire planet's military history combined. A young aide approached my desk as the chamber emptied, her hands trembling slightly as she held out a data slate. "Liaison Sol," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is something else, something we found while reviewing the contact logs before this session began." I took the slate from her hands, my fingers feeling strangely heavy. "What is it?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing toward the doors as though afraid someone might overhear, though the chamber was nearly empty now. "The humans," she said. "During the early contact phase, while our delegation was reviewing their culture and capabilities, they were doing the same to us. Quietly, through their own scanning systems, far less advanced than ours, but persistent." I felt a chill settle into my chest. "They were studying us," I said, more to myself than to her. "Yes," she said, "but it goes further than that. According to the timeline embedded in these records, they began their analysis of our fleet capacity, our response patterns, our historical conflicts with other species, almost immediately after first contact, before we had even finished our standard cultural exchange protocols." I scrolled through the data on the slate, my eyes moving faster as the implications settled deeper into my mind. The humans had not spent their early contact period in awe of us, learning about our culture and accepting their place within council hierarchy. They had spent it gathering information, quietly, patiently, treating the entire process not as an introduction but as an evaluation. They were never afraid of us, I said slowly. They were measuring us the entire time. The aide nodded, her expression caught somewhere between fear and a strange kind of fascination. And liaison soul, she added, her voice dropping even lower. There is a final entry, logged only 6 hours ago, shortly before their refusal message was sent. What does it say? I asked, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. She took the slate back from my hands and scrolled to the final line, then turned it toward me so I could read it myself. It was a fragment of an internal human communication, intercepted by one of our listening posts near their solar system. A brief exchange between two human officials, the kind of casual remark made when people believe no one outside their own circle is listening. It read simply, "They think the ships are supposed to scare us. Let them keep thinking that." I set the slate down on the desk in front of me and sat in silence for a long moment, the empty chamber stretching out around me like a held breath. Every species we had ever encountered measured power by the size of a fleet, the strength of a weapon, the reach of an empire. Every species we had ever encountered understood, instinctively, that survival meant accepting your place within a larger order, however uncomfortable that place might be. The humans understood this too. I could see that clearly now. They simply did not believe it applied to them. And somewhere out among the stars, an entire civilization had looked at the full might of the Galactic Council, weighed it carefully, and decided, calmly and without a trace of fear, that it was not worth bowing to. The hour of recess would end soon, and the council would reconvene to decide what came next. But as I sat there in the quiet, staring at 4 words still burning behind my eyes, I understood something the rest of the chamber had not yet grasped. This was not the end of a negotiation. It was the beginning of something none of us had ever faced before, and none of our old methods would be enough to answer it. The council reconvened exactly 1 hour later, and this time the chamber felt different. The panic from before had not faded. It had simply gone quiet, the way fear does right before someone makes a dangerous decision. Holdrun Vey stood at the center podium, 4 eyes scanning the gathered delegates before he spoke. "I have reviewed every record available on the human species," he said. "Their history is short compared to most civilizations represented here. Their technology, while advancing quickly, remains well below Council standard, and yet somehow they have refused us without hesitation." A delegate from the Outer Ring Systems, a thin armored being named Drellis Kor, rose from his seat. "Then the answer is simple," he said. "We remind them of their place. A single demonstration near their home world will correct this misunderstanding within days." Several delegates murmured in agreement. I felt my stomach tighten at the casual way he suggested it, as though human lives were a line item to be adjusted. I requested permission to speak, and Holdren granted it with a small nod. "Arbiter," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I would caution against assuming a demonstration of force will produce the same result it has with previous species. We have already shown them our fleet. They were not moved by it." Drellis turned toward me, his armored plating shifting with the motion. "Then we show them something closer," he said, "something that cannot be laughed away from a safe distance." The suggestion hung in the air, ugly and plain. I glanced around the chamber and saw too many delegates nodding along, their fear curdling into something far more dangerous than panic. Before I could respond, the USA representative stood, her tall frame commanding immediate attention. "I have spent my career studying conflict resolution between council worlds," she said. "I have never seen aggression solve a problem rooted in confusion. We do not yet understand why the humans refused us. Until we understand that, any action we take is a guess, and a forceful guess is the most dangerous kind." Drellis scoffed, a harsh sound translated imperfectly through his collar device. "We do not need to fully understand a species to remove an obstacle from our path," he said. The chamber went still. Even those who had been nodding along with him a moment before seemed to flinch at the bluntness of his words. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that the conversation had crossed into territory the Council rarely admitted out loud, even when it was the truth behind every treaty we had ever written. Holdrun raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that followed. "They do not appear to fear us either, apparently," he said, his voice carrying a dry edge that was almost, but not quite, amusement. "That is rather the problem we are facing." I took the opportunity to continue. "Arbiter, before any decision is made regarding force, I would like permission to review the human side of this exchange more thoroughly." Their refusal came with no explanation. I believe understanding their reasoning is more valuable right now than any show of strength. Holdrun considered this for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly across the chamber, as if weighing the mood of every delegate present. "Permission granted," he said finally. "You have 3 days, Liaison Soul. After that, this council will vote on a course of action, with or without your insight." 3 days felt impossibly short for a problem this size, but I accepted the assignment without hesitation. Better 3 days of careful work than a single moment of conflict born from panic. I left the chamber and made my way to the archive division, where every recorded exchange between the council and the human delegation had been stored since first contact. The room was vast, lined with data terminals tended by archivists who rarely spoke above a whisper, as though the weight of so much history demanded quiet. I requested the full record of the human delegation's communications, every transcript, every recorded meeting, every casual remark caught by translation devices during the cultural exchange phase. The lead archivist, an elderly being named Pel Anoran, brought the records to my terminal personally. "You are the one investigating the refusal," she said. It was not a question. "I am," I said. She studied me for a moment with eyes that had clearly seen many decades of council history pass through this very room. "I have worked in this archive for 60 years, she said. "I have read the contact records of every species that has ever joined the council. I have never read anything quite like what is contained in these files." "What do you mean?" I asked. She gestured toward the terminal. "Read it yourself," she said. "You will understand soon enough." I began with the earliest recorded exchange, dated from the very first hours of contact. A human woman named Eleanor Whitfield had served as the lead representative during initial communications, and her early statements were recorded in careful detail by our translation systems. The first thing that struck me was how calm she was. Not performed calm, the kind some species use to mask fear during negotiations, but a genuine, almost casual steadiness, as though meeting an alien civilization for the first time was simply another item on a long list of tasks to complete that day. When our delegation explained the structure of the council, the tribute system, the protective fleet that ensured order across 1,000 worlds, Eleanor had asked a single question that the translation log marked with unusual emphasis, suggesting our own systems had flagged it as significant. She had asked, "And what happens to the worlds that say no?" Our delegation, following standard protocol, had explained that no civilized species had ever refused the accord, since the benefits of protection and inclusion far outweighed the costs of tribute. This was, of course, true. It had simply never needed to be tested before. Eleanor's response, according to the log, had been a long pause, followed by a simple statement. "That is not really an answer," she said. "That is a hope." I sat back from the terminal, feeling the weight of that exchange settle over me. From the very first conversation, the human representative had identified the one flaw in our entire system. We had built an empire of cooperation not on certainty, but on the simple fact that worry had always been enough to prevent anyone from testing the alternative. I continued through the records, watching the pattern repeat itself again and again. Every time our delegation presented information meant to inspire respect or caution, the human representatives responded not with admiration, but with careful, pointed questions. They asked about the founding conflicts of the council, the events referenced only briefly in our official histories. They asked what had happened to species that had attempted to negotiate better terms in the past, rather than accepting the standard accord without modification. Our delegation's answers, intended to be reassuring, instead painted a picture that, when viewed plainly, was far less comforting than we had ever realized. I found a particular exchange that made my hands go still on the terminal controls. A human officer named Daniel Okafor had asked our delegation directly about the fate of a species called the Varan Collective, a civilization that, according to old council records, had attempted to negotiate modified tribute terms nearly 3 centuries ago. Our delegation, again following protocol, had explained honestly that the Varen Collective had ultimately accepted the Standard Accord after what was termed a period of correction. Daniel's follow-up question had been simple and direct. "What does correction mean, exactly?" he asked. The translation log showed a pause of nearly 11 seconds before our delegation provided an answer, a hesitation that, looking back now, told its own story more clearly than any words could have. I sat alone in the archive for hours, moving through record after record, watching as the humans slowly built a complete and accurate picture of exactly what the Council was, stripped of the careful language we used to describe ourselves in official documents. They had not been deceived during contact. They had simply refused to accept our version of events without independently confirming it for themselves. Near the end of the cultural exchange phase, I found a recorded internal meeting among the human delegation, captured by a microphone none of them had realized was still transmitting after an official session had ended. It was not meant for our ears, and reviewing it now felt like trespassing into something private, though I forced myself to continue, knowing the Council needed every available piece of information. In the recording, a younger member of the delegation, a woman named Priya Malhotra, spoke with clear frustration in her voice. "They keep acting like joining is the only option," she said. "Like there is nothing else we could possibly do except sign and pay and be grateful." Daniel Okafor's voice answered her, calm but firm. "Because for everyone else, there was not another option," he said. "Everyone before us looked at that fleet and made the safe choice. And we are not going to," Priya said. It was not phrased as a question. There was a pause in the recording, long enough that I leaned closer to the terminal, waiting. "We have survived worse than ships in the sky," Daniel finally said. "We just have not survived it together yet. Maybe this is what finally does that." The recording ended there, the meeting room falling silent as the delegation dispersed for the evening. I sat back in my chair, staring at the blank screen, turning his words over in my mind. "We have survived worse than ships in the sky." I did not know what that meant, not specifically, but I understood its weight all the same. The humans did not see our fleet as the worst thing they had ever faced. They saw it as simply the newest thing, another challenge to be measured against a history I did not yet fully understand. I requested deeper historical records on human civilization, pulling files our analysts had compiled during the initial assessment phase, but had apparently never flagged as relevant to treaty negotiations. What I found over the following hours reshaped everything I thought I understood about the species sitting at the edge of Council space. Their recorded history was filled with conflict, yes, but also with something else, something our models had never properly accounted for. Pattern after pattern showed the same basic shape, repeating across centuries and continents. Whenever humans faced an overwhelming threat, whether from natural disaster, disease, or each other, their response was rarely submission. It was organization, cooperation born not from comfort, but from necessity. I found records of conflicts where smaller human forces, facing what should have been certain defeat against larger numbers, had instead found ways to endure through sheer persistence rather than superior strength. I found records of diseases that had killed millions, met not with despair, but with decades of relentless effort until cures were found. I found records of a species that, time and again, when shown the full scale of something meant to frighten them into submission, had instead asked a single quiet question among themselves. What do we do about it? Not whether to do something, simply what. I finally understood, sitting alone in that archive as the artificial lights dimmed to mark the passing of another cycle, why the human refusal had felt so different from anything the Council had encountered before. Every other species we had contacted measured their own strength against ours and made a calculated decision to comply. The humans had done the same calculation and reached an entirely different conclusion, not because they underestimated our power, but because they had a different definition of what made a threat worth fearing. I gathered the most important records into a single report, my hands moving quickly now, driven by an urgency I had not felt at the start of this assignment. The Council needed to understand this before the vote in 3 days. Not the surface details of human refusal, but the deeper truth beneath it. This was not a species reacting out of ignorance or pride. This was a species that had looked carefully at everything we represented, weighed it against their own long and difficult history, and decided that whatever came next, they would face it standing rather than kneeling. As I left the archive that evening, the corridors of the council building quiet and dim around me, I carried with me a growing certainty that troubled me more than any fleet ever could. We were not dealing with a species that needed to be taught a lesson. We were dealing with a species that had already learned every lesson worth learning and simply refused to let fear write the ending for them. I spent the next 2 days compiling my findings into a report I knew the council would not want to hear. I included every relevant record, every quiet exchange, every moment where the human delegation had shown not fear, but careful calculation. I wrote it as plainly as I could, stripping away the diplomatic language I usually relied on, because I understood now that careful language was part of how the council had deceived itself for centuries. On the morning of the 3rd day, I stood once again at the center podium, the full council assembled before me. Holdrun gave me the floor, and I felt every eye in the chamber settle on me at once. "I do not believe the humans refused us out of ignorance," I began. "I do not believe they refused us out of misplaced confidence either. I believe they refused us because, after careful study, they concluded that compliance carries risks equal to or greater than refusal, and they would rather face those risks on their own terms." Drellis Core rose immediately, his patience clearly worn thin by 2 days of waiting. "This council does not require a philosophy lesson," he said. "It requires a decision. Either the humans accept the accord, or they face the consequences every other species has accepted as fair and necessary." I held my ground, though I felt the weight of his irritation pressing against me. "Then I would ask this council to consider what those consequences actually achieve," I said. "We have built our entire system on the assumption that no species would ever test it. That assumption has now failed. If we respond with force against a species that has made no threat of its own, we are not enforcing order. We are revealing exactly what our order has always been built upon." The chamber fell into uneasy silence. Even Drellis seemed to hesitate, though I could not tell if it was from doubt or simple irritation at being challenged in front of so many delegates. Holdrun finally spoke, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had governed through many difficult decisions before this one. "We will vote," he said. "Those in favor of an immediate show of force near New Terra, to compel compliance with the accord, signal now." I watched the chamber carefully as hands and limbs and various other appendages rose throughout the room. The vote was close, far closer than I expected, but it ultimately fell in favor of a measured approach. Rather than military action, the Council authorized a single small diplomatic vessel to travel to Earth and attempt direct negotiation, with myself appointed as lead liaison given my research into the species. It was not the outcome Drellis wanted, and his expression as the vote concluded made that very clear. But it was, I believed, the only outcome that gave us any chance of avoiding a conflict that could not be undone once started. 3 days later, I stood aboard a small council vessel, watching through the viewport as the blue and white sphere of Earth grew larger ahead of us. My team consisted of 4 others, including a young technical officer named Mira Kassan and an experienced security advisor named Tobrin Hale, both of whom had been assigned to ensure the mission's safety without provoking unnecessary alarm. We had transmitted our intentions clearly before approaching, requesting permission to enter orbit for the purpose of continued dialogue. The response, when it finally came, was brief, but at least it was a response, which felt like progress, after the silence following the original refusal. "Permission granted," the message read. "Approach slowly. Do not deploy additional vessels." We followed every instruction precisely. As our ship settled into orbit above the planet, I found myself staring down at the surface below, at the scattered lights of human cities visible even from this distance, and felt a strange mixture of caution and curiosity I had not expected. For 6 hours, nothing happened. No further communication arrived. No vessel approached us. We simply hung in orbit, waiting, the silence stretching longer than felt comfortable. Tobrin grew visibly tense as the hours passed, his hand resting near the small defensive controls built into the command console, though he never touched them. "They are watching us decide what to do," Mira said quietly at one point. breaking the long silence in the cabin. Just like we watched them. I considered her words, and found I agreed with the assessment. The humans were not ignoring us. They were observing, patiently, the same careful patience I had read about in their historical records, the same patience that had allowed them to survive challenges far beyond what any single demonstration of force could represent. In the 7th hour, a small craft detached from a structure orbiting the planet, far smaller than I expected given the gravity of the moment. It approached slowly, deliberately, without any aggressive maneuvering, and requested docking permission through a simple, calm transmission. We granted it immediately. The docking process completed without incident, and I stood near the airlock with my team, unsure exactly what to expect, as the mechanism hissed and the door slid open. A single figure stepped through. She was unarmed, dressed in a simple dark uniform without obvious markings of rank, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her expression calm in a way that immediately reminded me of the recordings I had studied for the past several days. She paused just inside the threshold, looking at each of us in turn, before her gaze settled on me. "You must be Liaison Soul," she said, her voice steady and clear, even through the translation device. "I have read your reports." I felt a small jolt of surprise at that. Our internal communications were not meant to be accessible outside Council systems. I was not aware those reports had been shared with your delegation, I said carefully. "They were not shared," she said, a faint trace of something that might have been amusement crossing her features. "We found them ourselves." I did not know how to respond to that, and judging by the brief silence from my own team, neither did they. The casual confidence in her statement carried an implication I was not yet ready to fully process. "My name is Naomi Brightwater," she said, extending a hand toward me in what I recognized from our cultural briefings as a traditional human greeting gesture. "I have been asked to continue this conversation on behalf of my government." I accepted the gesture, finding her grip firm but not aggressive, simply confident. "We appreciate your willingness to meet with us," I said, falling back into the formal language that had guided every previous negotiation of my career, though something about this moment already felt different from all of those. Naomi studied me for a long moment, her dark eyes carrying a weight that felt far older than the relatively short history of her species. "Let us be honest with each other, Liaison Soul," she said. "I did not come here to apologize for our refusal, and I did not come here to negotiate new terms for the accord. I came here because I believe your council is making decisions based on incomplete information, and incomplete information leads to mistakes neither of us can afford." I gestured toward the small meeting space adjoining the airlock, a simple room with a table and chairs designed for exactly this kind of diplomatic exchange. "Then perhaps we should sit," I said, "and share what each of us actually knows." She nodded once and moved toward the room without hesitation, her posture relaxed, despite being entirely surrounded by a species she had only recently encountered, aboard a vessel built by a civilization capable of crushing her entire world without significant effort. As we settled into our seats, my security advisor Tobrin standing quietly near the door, I found myself studying her more closely. There was no performance in her calm, no carefully constructed mask hiding fear underneath. She simply was calm, the way a person is calm when they have already considered every possible outcome of a situation and made peace with each one before it happened. "Before we begin," I said, choosing my words with care, "I would like to understand something. Why send a single representative? Why not a larger delegation, military advisors, additional security?" Naomi's expression shifted slightly, something thoughtful entering her features. "Because a larger delegation would suggest we believe numbers matter here," she said. "They do not. If this conversation fails, additional people in this room would not change that outcome, and if it succeeds, we will not have needed them either way." I considered this answer carefully, recognizing in it the same pattern I had found throughout the archive records. A species that did not measure strength the way we measured it. A species that seemed to believe conviction mattered more than numbers. Preparation mattered more than display. "Then let us ensure this conversation succeeds," I said. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her hands folding together on the table between us. "I would like to start with a question," she said. "One I asked your delegation during our very first meeting, and one I never received a satisfying answer to. I remembered the question from the archive records immediately, though I let her ask it again, understanding that this time, the council itself would be listening through my own recorded report. "What happens to the worlds that say no?" she asked. The question hung in the small room between us, carrying far more weight now than it had in the original transcript, spoken directly to me by the very person who had first asked it. "I have spent the last several days searching for an honest answer to that question," I said slowly. "I believe I owe you the truth, even if it is not the answer either of us wants to hear." Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted slightly, a small adjustment that told me she was listening more closely now than before. "Then tell me the truth, Liaison Saul," she said. I came a very long way to hear it. I took a slow breath, aware that whatever I said next would shape not just this conversation, but quite possibly the future relationship between two civilizations that had only just begun to understand each other. "The truth," I said, "is that no species has ever said no before. Not because they were satisfied with the terms offered, but because every species before yours looked at the cost of refusal and judged it too high to risk. The accord was never truly voluntary. It simply never needed to call itself anything else, because no one had ever tested whether the choice was real." Naomi was quiet for a long moment, her gaze steady on mine. "So we are the first ones to ask if the door was ever actually open," she said. "Yes," I said, "I believe you are." A faint, humorless smile crossed her face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Then it seems we have more in common with your council than either of us realized," she said. "We have both been pretending a question was already answered, simply because no one had been brave enough to ask it out loud before now." I felt something shift in the room then, a subtle change in the tone of our conversation, as though we had moved past the careful posturing of formal negotiation and into something closer to honest exchange between two people trying to solve a problem neither of them had created, but both of them now had to face. "This is only the beginning of our conversation," I said. "There is much more the council needs to understand, and I suspect there is much more your government needs to understand about us as well." Naomi nodded slowly, her expression settling back into the calm, measured composure she had carried since stepping aboard our vessel. "Then let us not waste the time it took to get here," she said. "Ask me what you truly want to know, Liaison Soul. I promise you an honest answer, even if you do not like what it reveals." I looked at her for a long moment, aware that the next words spoken in this small room would determine far more than the outcome of a single treaty. They would determine whether two civilizations, separated by vast distance and even vaster difference in experience, could find a way forward that did not end in the very conflict both of us claimed to want to avoid. "Then let us begin," I said, and reached for the data slate resting on the table, ready to record whatever truths this conversation was about to reveal. Naomi studied the slate for a moment before continuing, her composure unshaken. "I want to understand the Varen Collective," she said. "Your records mention a period of correction after they attempted to negotiate modified terms. I want to know what that means, in plain language, not council language." I felt my chest tighten slightly, recognizing immediately that she was steering this conversation exactly where I had feared it might go. "The Varen Collective requested a delay in their tribute payments during a period of internal famine," I said carefully. "The council viewed this request as a test of the Accord's authority, rather than a genuine hardship. A fleet was dispatched to demonstrate the consequences of non-compliance. The famine ended shortly afterward, though not through any assistance offered by the council." Naomi's expression remained level, though I noticed her fingers tighten slightly where they rested on the table. "How many died?" she asked. "During that demonstration?" I did not have an exact number memorized, and for a moment I considered offering a vague estimate that might soften the truth. But I had promised her honesty, and I understood now that anything less would only confirm every suspicion she already carried about us. "The official record states approximately 40,000, I said. "Unofficial estimates from surviving Varen historians suggest the number was closer to 3 times that figure." Naomi absorbed this information without visible reaction, though something in the stillness of her posture told me the calm was costing her more effort than it had moments before. And the Accord considers this an acceptable cost of maintaining order, she said. It was not phrased as a question. The Accord does not officially acknowledge those numbers at all, I admitted. The history taught to most Council citizens describes the Varen situation as a brief misunderstanding, resolved through firm but fair Council intervention. A brief misunderstanding, Naomi repeated quietly, the words carrying a weight that made my own translation device seem to struggle slightly with their tone. That is one way to describe it. I felt the need to offer something more, some context that might explain, if not excuse, the actions of a council I had served faithfully for most of my adult life. The council was younger then, I said. The structures of governance were less refined. Many of the policies that led to that decision have since been revised. Have they? Naomi asked, her gaze sharp now in a way it had not been before. Then tell me, liaison soul, what would happen today if a member world requested a delay in tribute payments due to genuine hardship? I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped, recognizing that I did not actually know the current policy with certainty. I had spent my career managing initial contact and cultural exchange, not the deeper administrative processes governing tribute enforcement after a species had already joined. I am not certain, I admitted. I would need to consult with the appropriate division before answering accurately. Naomi nodded slowly, as though this admission confirmed something she had already suspected. That is precisely the problem, she said. An institution that cannot quickly answer a simple question about its own enforcement policies is an institution that has never needed to answer it before, because no one has ever successfully challenged it. I felt the truth of her observation settle uncomfortably in my chest. She was right, and worse, I suspected she already knew she was right before she asked the question, using it not to gather information for herself, but to demonstrate something to me, and through me, to the council itself. Let me ask you something in return, I said, hoping to shift the conversation toward ground that might prove more productive for both of us. Your government has clearly studied our history extensively. You understand the risks of refusal better than most species who have accepted the Accord without question. Why take this risk at all? What does your government believe it gains by refusing protection that every other council world considers essential to their survival? Naomi was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting briefly toward the small viewport in the meeting room, where the curve of her home planet remained visible in the distance. We do not believe the protection is real, she said finally. We believe it is the price the council charges for permission to exist without being made an example of. Those are very different things, liaison soul, even if your official language treats them as identical. I considered her words carefully, recognizing the distinction she was drawing, though it challenged assumptions so fundamental to my understanding of council governance that I struggled to immediately accept it. The fleet exists to maintain order across member worlds, I said, to prevent conflicts between species, to respond to threats that no single world could face alone. Has the fleet ever responded to an external threat? Naomi asked, one that did not originate from a member world questioning council authority. I searched my memory for an example and found, to my growing discomfort, that I could not immediately recall one. Every deployment I could remember had been directed inward, toward member worlds, rather than outward, toward genuine external dangers. I would need to verify that against official records, I said carefully, though I suspected the verification would not improve the answer. Naomi's expression softened slightly, not with triumph, but with something closer to weary understanding. I am not trying to humiliate you, liaison soul, she said. I believe you are asking these questions honestly, perhaps for the first time in your career, but you must understand why we cannot simply accept an accord built on assumptions your own council apparently cannot fully defend when questioned directly. I leaned back slightly in my chair, feeling the full weight of the conversation pressing down on me in a way no previous negotiation in my career ever had. What would your government accept? I asked. If not the standard accord, what terms would allow both our civilizations to move forward without conflict? Naomi considered this question for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her words carried a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. We do not want tribute, she said. We do not want a fleet stationed near our world, regardless of its stated purpose. What we want is information. Complete, honest information about every conflict the Council has ever been involved in. The true outcomes, not the official histories. We want to understand exactly what we would be agreeing to before any further discussion of formal relations between our civilizations. This is an extraordinary request, I said. The Council has never opened its full historical records to an outside species before formal membership. Then perhaps that itself is worth examining, Naomi said. An organization that requires trust before it is willing to earn that trust through transparency is asking for something it has not properly justified. I sat with her words for a long moment, recognizing the impossible position she had placed me in. I had been sent here to negotiate a path back toward the accord, to find some compromise that would satisfy the Council's need for order while addressing whatever concerns had driven the human refusal. Instead, I found myself facing a request that, if granted, would expose the Council's entire history to scrutiny it had successfully avoided for centuries. And if the Council refuses this request, I said quietly, what then? Naomi met my gaze directly, her calm fully restored now, settled and certain in a way that made the question feel almost rhetorical before she even answered it. Then we remain exactly where we are now, she said. We do not attack your Council. We do not threaten your worlds. We simply continue building our own strength, on our own terms, until the day comes when refusing us carries a cost your Council is no longer willing to pay. The quiet confidence in her statement unsettled me more than any threat could have. There was no anger in her words, no bravado, simply a calm acceptance of a path forward that did not depend on the Council's approval at all. You believe that day will come, I said. I believe every civilization eventually reaches a point where it must decide what it is willing to accept simply because resisting feels impossible, Naomi said. We reached that point and decided differently than every species before us. I cannot promise you our path will succeed. I can promise you we have already decided to walk it regardless of the outcome. I sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what she had told me. This was not a negotiation in the traditional sense, the kind where two parties searched for a compromise that satisfied both their interests. This was something closer to a warning, delivered with perfect calm, about a future neither of us could fully predict, but one she seemed entirely prepared to face regardless of how the Council ultimately responded. I will bring your request to the Council, I said finally. I cannot promise they will accept it. The history you are asking us to reveal includes events many delegates would prefer remain buried. I understand that, Naomi said, but understand this in return, Liaison Soul. We are not asking because we believe the truth will be comfortable. We are asking because we believe we deserve to make our decision based on reality, rather than the carefully managed version of reality your Council has offered every species before us. She remained seated a moment longer than I expected, her gaze drifting toward the small viewport again, watching the curve of her homeworld pass slowly beneath us. May I tell you something that will not appear in any official record of this meeting, she said. I nodded, setting the data slate down gently, sensing that whatever she intended to say next was meant for me alone rather than for the Council. When the fleet first appeared above our planet, she said, there were people who wanted to surrender immediately. Entire governments prepared statements of compliance before any formal request had even been made. They believed resistance was pointless, that the only sensible choice was to accept whatever terms were offered and hope for mercy. What changed their minds, I asked. A woman named Eleanor Whitfield stood in front of those same governments and asked them a single question, Naomi said. She asked whether they were preparing to surrender because they had examined the situation carefully or because they were simply frightened and wanted the fear to stop. I remembered Eleanor's name from the archive records, the same calm voice that had asked our delegation what happened to worlds that refused. And what did they decide, I asked. They decided fear was a reasonable thing to feel, Naomi said, but a poor reason to make permanent decisions. So they slowed down, they studied, they asked harder questions instead of accepting comfortable answers. That decision is the only reason I am sitting in this room today, rather than signing tribute paperwork on behalf of a planet that gave up before it understood what it was giving up to. I sat with this story for a long moment, recognizing in it the same pattern I had traced through every record in the archive, the same instinct that had shaped a species capable of standing calmly before a fleet larger than anything in their own history. Your council relies on speed, Naomi continued. Fear works best when there is no time to think clearly. We simply refuse to let the clock decide for us. That is a dangerous habit to maintain indefinitely, I said quietly. Eventually, a decision must be made. We have made our decision, Naomi said. We are simply unwilling to make it based on incomplete information, manufactured urgency, or the assumption that compliance is the only realistic outcome available to us. Before you return to your vessel, I said, standing as well, may I ask you one final question? Naomi paused near the door, turning back toward me with an expression that suggested she already anticipated what I might ask. Of course, she said. Are you afraid of what happens if the council decides force is the only remaining option? I asked. Despite everything we have discussed here today, Naomi considered the question for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice carried neither boastfulness nor false confidence, simply a steady honesty that I suspected defined everything about her species I had yet to fully understand. Yes, she said simply, I am afraid. Every person I represent is afraid, in one way or another, but fear has never been the thing that decides what we do next, liaison soul. It never has been. Throughout our entire history, we feel it, and then we choose anyway. With that, she turned and walked back through the airlock, her small craft detaching from our vessel minutes later and descending back toward the surface of her world, leaving me standing in the quiet meeting room with a data slate full of recordings that I knew would change the course of this entire crisis, regardless of how the council chose to respond to them. The journey back to council space felt longer than the journey out had been, though the distance was identical. I spent most of it reviewing my recording of the conversation with Naomi, listening to her voice again and again, searching for any detail I might have missed, any opening that could lead toward a resolution that did not require the council to expose its full history to outside scrutiny. I found none. Every path forward led back to the same impossible choice. Either the council revealed truths it had spent centuries burying, or it accepted that humanity would continue building its strength independently, indefinitely, without ever formally joining the order that governed every other known civilization. When we finally arrived back at council headquarters, I requested an emergency session immediately, knowing that whatever I reported would need to reach every delegate before opinions hardened into positions that would be difficult to shift later. The chamber was full when I entered, the air thick with anticipation that had clearly been building since news of our return spread through the building. Holdren Vey stood at the podium, his 4 eyes fixed on me as I approached the speaking platform. Report your findings, liaison soul, he said. I activated the recording I had prepared, allowing the chamber to hear Naomi's voice directly, rather than relying solely on my own summary. I watched the delegates' faces as her questions about the Varen Collective played through the chamber speakers, watched the discomfort spread as the true casualty figures were spoken aloud in a setting where they had rarely, if ever, been acknowledged so plainly. When the recording finished, silence held the chamber for several long moments before Drellis Kor rose, his expression carrying none of the dismissiveness he had shown days earlier. This human representative is requesting access to information that has remained sealed for centuries, he said. Information that, if revealed, could damage the Council's standing with every member world currently operating under the assumption that our history is one of fair and necessary governance. That assumption was already false before this conversation took place, I said. The human representative simply asked us to stop pretending otherwise. A different delegate, an elder from a species called the Halvoran, rose slowly from her seat near the back of the chamber. I had rarely heard her speak in previous sessions, though her reputation for careful judgment was well known throughout the council. I have served on this council for over 2 centuries, she said, her voice carrying the slow weight of someone who had witnessed many crises pass through this very chamber. I remember the Varen Collective. I remember voting in favor of the demonstration that led to those deaths, believing at the time that it was necessary to preserve order across our worlds. The chamber remained silent, every delegate's attention fixed on her as she continued. I have told myself for centuries that the decision was correct, given what we knew and believed at the time, she said. I am no longer certain that comfort was ever honestly earned, rather than simply accepted because questioning it served no immediate purpose. Huldrun studied her for a long moment before turning back toward the chamber as a whole. The question before this council is no longer simply how to respond to a single refusal, he said. It is whether the foundation our entire order rests upon can survive honest examination, and if it cannot, what that means for everything we have built across all these centuries. Drellis shook his head sharply, clearly unwilling to accept the direction the conversation had taken. This is exactly the kind of hesitation that invites further challenges, he said. If we open our records to one species simply because they refuse to comply, every future negotiation will include the same demand. We will have taught every world in known space that refusal is rewarded with concessions no one else has ever received. Perhaps refusal should be rewarded with honesty, the Halvoran elder said quietly. Perhaps that is precisely the standard every species deserves, rather than the one we have simply never been forced to provide before now. The debate continued for hours, delegates rising and sitting in turn, arguments circling the same fundamental tension without resolution. Some insisted that revealing the council's full history would invite chaos, weakening an order that had, despite its flaws, prevented countless conflicts between member worlds over the centuries. Others argued that an order maintained through selective truth was no real order at all, simply control wearing the appearance of legitimacy. I listened to all of it, saying little, understanding that my role in this particular debate had already been fulfilled. I had carried the truth back from Earth as honestly as I knew how. What the Council chose to do with that truth was no longer within my control. As the session stretched into its 6th hour, Huldrun finally called for a vote, though I could see in his expression that he did not expect a clean resolution either way. The proposal before this council, he said, is whether to grant the human request for full historical disclosure as a condition for continued diplomatic engagement, without guarantee of eventual accord acceptance. The vote, when it came, revealed a council deeply divided in ways I had never witnessed during my career. Roughly half the delegates voted in favor, swayed by the Halvoran elder's quiet admission and the growing discomfort many clearly felt after hearing Naomi's recorded words directly. The other half voted against, fearing the precedent such transparency might set for every future negotiation the council would ever conduct. The vote ended in a tie, a result so rare that the chamber fell into confused murmuring as officials consulted procedural records to determine what should happen next. Huldrun raised his hand for silence, and slowly, the chamber settled. In the event of a tied vote on a matter of this significance, he said, the decision falls to the arbiter's office, as outlined in our founding charter. Every eye in the chamber turned toward him, waiting. He was quiet for a long moment, his 4 eyes moving slowly across the assembled delegates, before finally settling on me. Liaison Soul, he said, you have spent more time directly engaging with this species than anyone else in this chamber. I would ask you one final question before I render this decision. Do you believe revealing our history will lead to greater conflict, or will withholding it simply delay a conflict that has already become unavoidable? I considered his question carefully, aware that whatever I said next would likely shape the final outcome of this entire crisis. I do not believe humanity intends conflict, I said. I believe they intend honesty, and they will continue building their strength regardless of what this council decides today. The only question is whether we face that future as an institution willing to be questioned, or one that simply waits for the questioning to happen anyway, on terms we no longer control. Huldrun nodded slowly, seeming to weigh my words against decades of experience governing through crises far different from this one. Then, I will grant the human request, he said finally. Full historical disclosure, provided through controlled and verified channels, in exchange for continued diplomatic engagement. This does not guarantee eventual acceptance of any future accord. It guarantees only that whatever decision humanity ultimately makes will be made with complete information, rather than the careful omissions this council has relied upon for far too long. The chamber erupted into renewed argument, though I noticed something different in the tone this time. Less panic and more genuine uncertainty about what this decision would mean for the future of council governance as a whole. I left the chamber that evening carrying a strange mixture of relief and unease, uncertain whether the decision reached today represented genuine progress or simply the first crack in a structure that had remained unquestioned for far too long to easily withstand close examination now. 3 weeks passed before any further communication arrived from Earth. The historical records had been transferred through secure channels exactly as promised. Every documented conflict, every demonstration of force, every quiet correction the Council had ever authorized against a member world that questioned its authority too directly. I do not know precisely how that information was received on the human side, what conversations took place in their government chambers, what conclusions their leaders reached after finally seeing the complete picture they had requested. I was not present for those discussions, and Naomi Brightwater, despite several attempts at further contact, did not respond to my messages during that period. When a response finally arrived, it came not as a formal treaty proposal, nor as a renewed refusal, but as something stranger, and in its own way, more unsettling than either outcome would have been. "We have reviewed the information provided," the message read. "We require time to determine what it means for us. We will not be rushed into a decision built on incomplete understanding, just as we were not rushed into our original refusal. Further contact will occur when we are ready, not before." No timeline accompanied the message, no indication of how long that determination might take, whether it would be measured in months, years, or longer. Simply a statement of intent, calm and unwavering, exactly matching every interaction I had experienced with this species since the very beginning of this entire crisis. I brought the message before the Council, and this time the reaction was markedly different from the panic that had defined our very first emergency session weeks earlier. There was frustration, certainly, and no small amount of continued anxiety among delegates who preferred clear resolutions to open uncertainty. But the panic itself had transformed into something closer to wary respect, an acknowledgement that we were dealing with a civilization operating according to principles our centuries of governance had never adequately prepared us to understand. Holdrun Vey, addressing the chamber for what felt like the 100th time since this crisis began, offered words that I believe captured the moment more accurately than anything else spoken during those long, difficult weeks. "We built our entire order on the assumption that fear would always be enough," he said. "We have now encountered a species for whom it simply is not, and we must learn to govern in a universe where that is true, rather than pretending it remains the exception, rather than what may eventually become the rule." I think often, even now, about my final conversation with Naomi Brightwater, about her calm admission that fear had never been the thing deciding what her people did next. I think about the Varen Collective, about the Halvoran Elders' quiet confession after 2 centuries of unexamined comfort, about an entire council forced to confront a history it had successfully avoided questioning for far longer than it ever should have. I do not know what humanity will ultimately decide. I do not know whether they will eventually accept some modified form of the Accord, build their own independent path entirely separate from council governance, or choose something else altogether that none of us has yet imagined. What I do know, with a certainty that has only grown stronger since that first message arrived bearing 4 simple words, is that the old order, the one built on overwhelming force and the assumption of universal compliance, no longer describes the universe we actually live in. Somewhere out among the stars, a small blue world continues building its strength, quietly and patiently, on its own terms, answering to no fleet, bowing to no demonstration of power, waiting for a moment of its own choosing rather than ours. And here in the chamber that has governed 1,000 worlds for longer than most species can accurately remember, we wait as well, no longer certain whether we are still the ones holding power, or simply the first to discover that power built on fear was never as solid as we always assumed it to be. The silence from Earth continues. I suspect, somehow, that it always will, in one form or another, for as long as our 2 civilizations continue this long and uncertain conversation, neither of us fully knows how to finish.